Hey folks, welcome back to Shadow Zone with my degenerate friend Shadow Jester. How you doing, Shadow Jester?
Pretty good. How are you doing,
Oh,
Shadowhawk?
I just did a shit ton of PCP, and now the world just makes so much more sense to me.
Interesting. So what are we talking about today?
Racism and
Racism.
D&D. So it's
And
not offensive.
D&D.
It's not offensive.
I'm not sure that's how that works, Shadowhawk.
It's fancy racism, so it doesn't count. It's fancy racism, so it doesn't count.
Giga Chad question mark? Anyway, folks.
So,
What Shadowhawk about fantasy racism do you want to cover first?
well, here's my D&D games. Just a quick little outlier. I do a lot of racism in my D&D games. People get offended by that. Think I have it. In my game,
Shadowhawk, you extreme hatred of short people.
midgets, hobbits, gnomes, dwarves are okay. Every D&D game I usually run, hobbits are degenerate, drunken farmers. They're the trash of the empire, or they're a bunch of fucking high.
In every game you run, Shadowhawk.
Hey, people have said I literally been so stupid they think I hate short people in real life just because I hate short people in fantasy.
Anyway, so what was the question?
So when it comes to racism in fantasy, what first comes to your mind? What can you think of good examples of it?
So when I think of fantasy racism, I think honestly, when I think of fantasy racism, there are two things that come up in my mind. There was Bright, the movie, with how orcs are treated, played by Will Smith, main character in that movie, and I honestly forget the co-star.
Was that the movie The Cops and it's like a fantasy world?
Yeah, and it's all about the wand. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I really think that that's probably the first one that comes up because orcs in that world, it was like Lord of the Rings in modern time because orcs were originally of the dark deities like,
Sauron,
Melkor. They were
Melkor.
originally a race built to wolf specifically for him. But as time went on, some defected, and even still, even though they defected and the Dark Lord is gone, they're still looked down upon because of the ancient writings and what they did in their past. Now, another race that I think very instrumentalizes this,
Whatever.
Yeah, sorry, folks. Um, Another race that I think very much represents this is the Tiefling in D&D because they have direct demonic roots and even speak the language of Infernal.
Infernal, yeah.
In some cases, to the point where they are literally demons. They have a conscience like a human. They are their own person, but they are directly descended from demons. And so a lot of people feel very uncomfortable and they don't like having them around because...
Plus, they're a bunch of
Tieflings are seen as directly connected to the demon race because of the direct demonic heritage. And not only that, in the games that I won, Shadowhawk, in the games that I won, there was a certain drug that the demons had used specifically on tieflings because of the demonic heritage. And it's basically a drug that makes the magical side of the demons go berserk. And it is called, I think I've actually named it Berserk after, if you folks read Berserk, the manga. It makes their muscle mass almost double in size. They become these towering, they're height doubles. They are just huge demonic demons, and they start just killing things without any wherewithal about what they're hitting or what they're doing. And because of this drug named Berserk, people in my world distrust tieflings even more because they are scared that they are going to go frenzy if they get even a hint of this drug. And this drug has extreme withdrawal symptoms and all this stuff. It was a tool used by the demonic lords to keep their minions in line so that they would be able to control them, even tieflings who weren't strictly demonic. So...
I mean, in my D&D games, which I play yours, you play mine, yes. In my world, the Tark Empire is literally based off the Imperium of Man from Warhammer, and all so there's a tier system of how accepted you are in the Empire. If you're human, you're on top. If you're subhuman or demi-human, like elf or dwarf, you're kind of like second-class citizens. But if you're like half orc, half elf, or like some sort of like beast folk or like hybrid race, the best you can hope for is live in the slums or live as a freaking pit slave or a gladiator or work in like the mines and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm trying to say here? It's like a tier system. Like, the closer you are to human, the more rights you have.
Yeah, which makes very much sense. And I think that fantasy racism is...
And not to mention, I like...
Cut it out. Anyway.
Alright, keep going.
So, what's another question, Shadowhawk, that you have about, since we finished that question, what would you like to move on to, Shadowhawk? What other question do you have about fantasy racism?
What series... So, talking about Warhammer 40k, do you feel like there's ever a need for racism in fantasy? Because a lot of these worlds, there's wars. Like, a lot of these worlds, like, where orcs are besieging...
Do I think that there was a need for racism in Fantasy and D&D? My answer to that is astoundingly yes. Because I'm sorry, if humans themselves in our world, even though this is fantasy, I understand that, if humans in our world are mad at each other just because our skin looks a little bit different, how do you think they're going to feel when there's a literal demon walking around that's a tiefling, or a literal orc that is twice their size and twice as strong as them? Of course they're going to subjugate them. At least at the beginning. Acceptance is not going to be something that's immediately said or worked. I really don't believe that that's how it will work. And especially in a world as clustered as D&D, with so many different types of races and half races and so many different types of monsters, I think you'd be weird to find somebody who is... I think in an actual world, which is why, you're the party, you're the adventurers, right? You can make the character you want, or the NPCs that you want, but I think in a general sense, you'd be pressed to find somebody who is not racist at all towards a specific group of, race, because there's so many races.
I mean...
It'd be very... It'd be like, imagine if there's an orc, right? Imagine if someone is racist against orcs, right? But they never see orcs because they just never come through their town, right?
So the difference between ignorance and full-blown...
Yeah, I don't think there'll be much racism, but I do think there'll be a lot of ignorance.
I mean,
astounding amount.
Going off that, I mean, somebody I've seen Elder Scrolls. There's entire...
Sorry to interrupt you, Shadowhawk, but you gotta be thinking about it. How many times is the average Hamlet farmer going to see a draconic, a half dragon, a half orc?
Very rarely.
Very rarely, if ever. In fact, they probably don't even think that's possible.
I mean, if we're talking about going off that, racial politics are also a huge thing in most fantasy worlds.
Exactly.
Sometimes, in Elder Scrolls, Argonians were slaves to the Dark Elves
for years,
for centuries.
Yeah, they were.
And then they rise up, and they completely, and once they rage their rebellion, they wipe out the Dark Elf kingdom, blow up their cities, and destroy their living gods.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That's something you got to take into account.
I think in most fantasy worlds and fantasy scenarios, racism is a given, unfortunately. As much as nowadays it's a hot topic for some reason. Well, I shouldn't say for some reason, for lots of good reasons. But when it comes to fantasy racism, I think it's a given. Because one of the things about racism in our world is that to talk about racism, we're only going to talk about real life racism for a very small segment of this podcast. But to identify what I mean when I say, of course, there's going to be racism in fantasy, is that in fantasy, okay, the races actually have shit. Okay, they do different things. You can't say that a half dragon and a half tiefling have the same shit. Some people, like the tiefling, some races just have, and I specifically would take these two to tell you about them. Both of these races have inherent abilities. Because they are a tiefling, they can summon magic. Because you are a dragon, you can spit acid, okay?
Or fire.
Or ice, or aquatic damage, or... I'm sorry, but in the real world, racism is an issue, and we're pretty much all the fucking same. None of us have special abilities. Right?
Correct.
Could you imagine in a world where there were actual people who could just spit on your face and melt your head off? Do you really think there wouldn't be racism?
Yeah. Now,
that is my problem with when people talk about fantasy racism, because of course there's going to be racism in fantasy because of how there's racism now, and we don't have any different the skin color is different, and that's all. There's a few genetic things, of course, but they are writing about minute or minor. In fact, most of those have to do. Most of the genetic shit that I'm talking about has to do because I am studying in the field of medicine. I'm not a doctor. Let me preface that, but I have studied some stuff, and I do know that most. You can even see it with like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. If you put your DNA in, most of your like think like health factors, risk factors for you, are based specifically on your family history. It's not about your race, it's your family history. For example, not to get too personal, but I know in my family, we have a high risk of heart attacks because that's just in the family. Now, that is not racism, that is genetics. That is not you. What is the word, Shadowhawk, that I'm looking for?
Eugenics.
That is not eugenics. Eugenics is based on a race, genetics is based on a family tree. So, and you gotta think, even think about eugenics, even in the fantasy universe. How bad is that gotta be when it's really like an entire
Warhammer 40k, Warhammer 40k,
like
Warhammer
it has
40k.
Gotta be terrible. So I think trying to get rid of racism. I guess we should probably be ending. So I would say that if you have a D&D game with different races, there has to be racism. Because I'm sorry, but I'm not going to take. Maybe this is just my personal opinion, but I'm not going to take your world seriously if everybody looks at everybody the same, as if there's not obvious magical differences.
Okay.
That is how I would say. I wouldn't be able to get into your world if there wasn't racism, because it just wouldn't make sense to me personally. Shadowhawk, what's your next question?
2 questions I want to have.
Let's start with one.
One thing I would say, when you look at like how do interspecies relations affect like the politics of a region, affect like the government, the social system, like look at Warhammer 40k, everyone hates each other and trying to wipe each other out. Or versus World of Warcraft, when you have entire alliances of different races and they're like forming military pacts and alliances and trade. How do you think fantasy racism fits in those sort of political social systems?
Well, I think it fits in the same way it does in the. Wait, what's your question? Like, how does fantasy influence the politics?
How does fantasy racism impact the politics of fantasy?
Well, it impacts the politics a whole bunch. Elves don't like orcs. Orcs don't like elves in general, usually. So they're gonna fight.
And there's gonna be endless conflicts, of course.
I wouldn't say endless conflict. I would say
Between
they can come to an agreement with, for example, the help of the main party. Maybe they can come to an agreement, but there's always gonna be animosity until they sort of sorry for getting a little bit too real here, but inbreeding. Until that happens, there's not really gonna be many.
Speaking of fantasy racism, how do you feel?
What was the next question you'd like to ask?
How do you feel about some recent years D&D and Wizards of the Coast has come under a lot of attack, and some people are against them, some people are for it. As in, like, before this recent edition of D&D happened, orcs were almost always chaotic evil. Elves were almost always lawful good, or something like that. How do you feel about that kind of like reclassification of like?
I actually think it's probably one of the better things to happen to D&D. Even in my game, which hopefully none of my players are watching this because it would be a major spoiler. My king is actually friends with 3 mind flayers.
Really?
You don't get to tell anyone about this. Don't.
I won't.
But in my game, because unfortunately Shadowhawk is part of my game.
Unfortunately.
Wow. Okay.
My game is better. My game is better.
Oh my god. Okay.
My game is better.
Whatever. Anyway, so, Shadowhawk, in my game, the king is assisted by 3 people, and you don't really know who they are. It's spontaneously the king god had fired all of his security inside his house, and he's been seen wandering alone at night with 3 robed figures. And you don't really know until later on in my game that those 3 figures are mind flayers. Because in my world and the way I play it, because I don't think assigning an entitled race to a particular type of like
alignment
is a good idea. I actually heavily vote against that, even in terms of monsters. Because in the way I play my D&D games, everything has a soul. There is no living thing that does not have a soul. Now, obviously, if you're like a cell, you can't really do anything. But if you're a monster and you somehow have an ascendancy of like, if you reach sentience, basically, it can happen for usually a traumatic event in a monster's life. For example, the Mind Flayers had their elder boy killed, and they saw all those siblings being slaughtered.
Have you been reading the lore recently?
Yeah, why?
Damn, okay, you're a nerd. But
the elder brain had been killed, which is basically their father.
Their hive mind.
That's what they view it as.
Their hive mind, yeah.
That's what these three viewed it as, was their father. And their siblings were slaughtered, and they were the only ones that escaped. And through that traumatic event, they reached ascendancy. Now, it doesn't have to be a traumatic event. It could be something as small as noticing a walk on the side of the road and truly thinking about how that affects them. But okay, so in my story, the three mind flayers who were assisting the king, and they fled because after having their elder boy killed, which they saw as their mother or father, their guardian, and their siblings slaughtered, they basically had an ascendancy. That traumatic event is what pushed them to ascendancy, and they broke out of their monster tendencies. They still have the instincts. Excuse me. They still have the monstrous tendencies, but they are their own people. And so they assist the king, they are bound to the king, but they allow themselves to be bound to the king completely and utterly of their own free will, which is something that most monsters would not do unless they had reached something which I call ascendancy. Basically, they ascended past they achieved ascendience. And actually, through enough training, any monster in my universe can achieve this. Well, depending on their intelligence stats, obviously easier or harder. But, and that goes with all the races too. I don't think having any race specifically plotted as chaotic evil or lawful good is a good idea. Because I don't believe, probably not a hot take, but I don't believe that any morality of anything is that easy. I don't think you can sweep an entire race and just say they're chaotic evil. That doesn't sound particularly right. Now, you can do that with monsters, but even monsters in my game can achieve ascendancy, which they are not anymore. It's up to them.
Right. Last subject, and this kind of goes back to your mind flayers. Do you think, it's ever right to wipe out entire species for the greater good in D&D or fantasy settings like that? Can you justify wiping out entire...
Tell me, can you justify genocide?
It was for mind flayers or dragons or demons.
Yes. There can be justifications for genocide.
In a fantasy setting.
In both settings.
Okay. Hot take.
Hot take. Very hot take. Okay, let me explain myself because this is going to get a little wild. So, in a fantasy universe, I probably should have said real life. I thought you were talking about fantasy. I don't mean real life. Real life is a lot different. Well, actually, no, it's not. Okay, so in real life, if a fucking alien race that only knew war, and if, for example, if let's say the Zorg or the Tyranids
invaded Earth.
A thing like the Tyranids, right?
Right.
In real life, yes, genocide is probably a good idea. Okay? Because the fucking Tyranids, they're not, it's like ants, dude. You're not gonna I'm sorry, I like ants too, but if ants were fucking 7 feet tall and could bench press multiple tanks, yeah, we might need to get rid of them. Okay? I'm sorry, if you think otherwise, well then, you know what, you have more mercy than I do. But in a fantasy world, yeah, genocide of I always laugh because people say genocide. You can't genocide. Genocide is not 100% guaranteed. Some are gonna escape no matter what you do.
Right.
So if you mean go on a crusade
against the mind flayers,
against mind flayers, then yeah, I would say that's okay. I mean, they're literally killing people for fun. They are hive mind. They're like ants. I mean, you can't tell an ant to not do that shit.
So a closing statement I want to say, and this would be a question we should both answer our own way. How do you think people should write racism into their fantasy worlds and their D&D? How do you think people should write racism into fantasy settings?
Hot take, I think they should write it however they want. I think there's no wrong way to write racism in a fantasy setting. Unless you're specifically using an allegory for real life groups of people, then yeah, that's pretty fucked up. But in terms of actually writing it, I don't think there's any bad way to write it per se.
Do you think 40K did it right? Warhammer 40K
yeah, 40K, dude. The human Imperium. A lot of people get on the human Imperium for being like extremely racist, but you also got to think 99% of what's out there is trying to fucking kill them.
Or enslave them, or fuck them for an eternity.
Yeah, or do all this other fucked up shit to them. They just they have multiple reasons to be very genocidal against a lot of Xenos. Okay, there's a reason. Okay, because they almost got killed multiple times. Human race almost died.
Context.
Hundreds of times. This isn't something they just decided out of the gate.
Well, I will say I'm going to end this in the note. I think you and me can both agree on this. We shouldn't shy away from racism in fantasy. I don't think we should shy away.
As I said before, Shadowhawk, I really can't take a world that doesn't, a fantasy world, like a fantasy D&D game, that doesn't have racism seriously. Because you can't look me in the eyes and tell me that a dragon, essentially, a half dragon, half elf, and a half orc, half tiefling, are not going to have questions when they see each other. You can't look me in the eyes and tell me that with a straight face, dude. They're going to look at each other, they have a lot of questions about what's going on. Okay?
Kind of like what we will be like when we meet Greys for the first time.
What?
The Greys, Roswell, aliens.
Oh, yeah, when we meet the Grey. Yeah, exactly. Like, it'd be like meeting a Grey and then just being like, oh, okay. No, you're going to freak the fuck out. You're going to be like, what the fuck is that?
Why'd you anal probe me? Why'd you anal probe me all those times?
That's like a fucking... I'm talking about just seeing them, dude. You're going to be like, what is going on, dude?
Well, it's been great, Shadow Jester. Thanks for joining the show. Until next time, folks, stay sane.